Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to episode 2 of the Pugilist Interviews. Arthur sat on his couch, staring at the object in his hands. He bought it the day before and was still marveling at it. It was a blank actor's mask, painted black. He had gone a few blocks from his house and popped into a store and grabbed it. Luckily, the store owner did not recognize him. In certain circles, he was still well known enough as to not be able to pass through without someone knowing who he was. But luckily, the UFC was not as widely known as football or some other sports. He would wear this mask, an undercover vest he bought at a surplus store outside of town, and his old training gear as he went to do his vigilante work. Eventually, he finally came to peace with his course of action when he heard the noise he had been dreading for the last 5 days. An unexpected knock at his front door. Detective Barbara Kane stopped for a moment to rub her forehead. It was not easy to track someone down who used a cell phone to call 911. It had taken her several days to track down what was, for the moment, her best lead. Her thought process had been, if she was able to track down the caller, then she could get a more full statement from him, and then once she cleared up a few things, then she could get into tracking down why these guys were in the alleyway and who would want to beat the shit out of them. Finally, here now in front of her was what she was looking for. The name of the person who owned the phone that made the call to 911. She opened up the courier envelope and took out the sheet of paper. Quickly reading through it, the owner of the phone was apparently an Arthur Yell who lived not too far from where the incident took place. The name tugged at the back of her mind. It seemed familiar, but she was not connecting it to anything. Most names that tugged at her like that were people who had committed a crime of some kind, or were otherwise involved in a crime. So she went to the case database and searched for the name Arthur Yell. Getting up from his couch, Arthur moved toward the door, setting the mask on a side table he had. Slowly opening the door, he found himself face to face with a woman who was probably in her 30s, well-dressed, and looking very professional. After a second, he realized there were 2 men behind her, carrying some kind of equipment. "Can I help you?" he asked as he finished taking in the entire scene playing out in his front yard. The woman smiled and held her hand out. "Yes, Mr. Yell, I am Diane Baker, and I work for Zuffa, LLC. I'm sure you remember the company." Her voice sort of trailed off to let him answer. Quickly taking her hand and shaking it, Arthur nodded. "Yes, of course I know Zuffa, the promotion company for UFC. What can I do for you?" He stepped back into the side, motioning her to enter along with the men behind her. "Well, tonight is the fight between Anderson Silva and Demian Maia. Since you're the last person to defeat Silva in the octagon, we're here for that scheduled interview for some last-minute hype. Didn't someone get a hold of you?" She finished that with an incredulous tone in her voice. Suddenly, Arthur remembered. "Oh, of course. I'm so sorry. I've had a really busy last few days, and I forgot that was today. I haven't heard from anyone since last week. Come, sit down." He quickly found a place for her to sit in his living room. "Ah, that must be it. Someone should have called yesterday to remind you. I'll have to have a word with them." She motioned, and the men started setting up their cameras and lighting, taking several trips to a van parked on the street outside. "Before we start, I want to put something out there in the sake of honesty and the fact that I liked watching you fight. This is to hype a fight between Silva and Maia. As such, some of the questions will not paint you in the best light. I hope you know that and are okay with that." Arthur nodded as he sat across from her. I can guess some of what you're probably going to ask. Probably going to bring up that ridiculous claim that I retired to avoid a rematch against Silva. Probably going to say something along the lines of how I was scared I'd lose to him in a second bout. Yes, that will come up, she said simply. Off the record, before we start though, why did you retire? You were at the top of your game and probably could have continued fighting for years with large purses. Arthur considered for a minute before shifting in his chair and answering a question he had been asked many times in the last 6 months, but hadn't told anyone. Completely off the record. My fighting record is perfect for a simple reason. My speciality was not getting hit. As you can see, my ears aren't cauliflowered or anything. He tilted his head each way to let her see his normal-shaped ears. There were many fights where they would throw, say, 400 punches my way, and about 15 of them would hit. My team and I had a lot of math and stats and video that we did many very boring things with. But what we figured out just before I retired, I had slowed a fraction of a second with my response times. It was too small for most people to notice, but it was there. Basically, 0.25% more punches would land on me. In essence, if I went into another fight with 400 punches thrown, 16 would hit instead of the former 15. On average, of course. So, since I didn't want to get hit that much, I quit, walked away, and have lived happily in my hometown ever since. After hours of searching, it finally occurred to Barbara to just search for the name in Google. And it came up. Arthur Yell was a former MMA fighter. He retired half a year ago to right here in Freedom City, where he was apparently from. One of the times they were all out to a sports bar or something, he must have been fighting on one of the TVs, and that's where she had heard the name. As she read more about him, it became more interesting. 4 guys get beaten up in an alley in a respectable part of town, and the guy who called it in was a breathy former professional fighter who happened to live less than a mile away. That was quite the coincidence. She would have to pay him a visit, and tonight. Diane left around 10 in the morning. The fight was apparently in the United Arab Emirates, so the fight would be about 1 p.m. local time. There was editing and such to do before they could air the segment. And Arthur spent the day on his couch. He was doing much better from the fight, but his back still hurt from where the stitches were. He missed the live viewing of the fight, but when the second showing came on at 10 p.m., he was watching it, a 6-pack of beer in hand. When he was about halfway through the pack, and the disgrace that was the Silva Maya fight was over, he had his second visitor of the day. If anything, this one was more unexpected. Getting up, he walked over to the door and answered it. This time an average-height woman he would guess was in her 40s, dressed in a suit that said government worker more than anything else, stood on his front step. She held up a badge for him to inspect and said, "Good evening, Mr. Yell. I apologize for the late call. I'm Detective Barbara Kane and would like to ask you some questions about an emergency call made from your cell phone on Monday." She was clearly impatient to be let in, so Arthur stepped aside and ushered her into his living room, shutting the door behind her. "Sure, Detective. How can I be of service?" he asked. "First off, are you aware that your cell phone was used to make an emergency call on Monday, April 5th? "Yes, Detective, I am aware of that. I made that call." "And why did you make that call?" He frowned for a second. She was being a little brisk for just following up on an emergency call. "Because I saw 4 men getting pummeled in an alleyway and figured it was my civic duty to call it in." She sat in a chair he offered her. "And what exactly did you see?" Her questioning was starting to put him on the defensive, and he didn't like it. "Exactly what I said in the phone call. I was walking by the alleyway on my way back home at the end of a walk when I happened to look down it and see 4 guys beating up one guy. I didn't really hear what they were talking about, but I believe I heard something about drugs. All of a sudden, another guy enters the alleyway, and when they threaten him, he beats the living shit out of them." As he was talking, Barbara was writing everything down in a small notebook. When he finished talking, she spent an agonizing time finishing up her writing and looked over it before looking back at him and asking, "Please clarify something for me. It seems like from your story quite a bit happened, and although you happened to be walking by, you stood there the entire time and watched?" Arthur shrugged. "It wasn't very long. The whole thing was maybe a minute or so. And as I said, I was walking back home at the end of a walk. I didn't really have anywhere to go." "And no one noticed you?" "Not as far as I'm aware." "How come they threatened this random guy and not you?" "I imagine because he was walking past them down the alleyway while I was still in the street outside the alley." "So you were far enough away that they didn't see you." "How is it then that you heard what they were talking about?" Arthur shrugged again. "As I said, I didn't really hear them. I got a word here and there at best, and came to the conclusion they were talking about drugs." She decided to pivot back to a slightly earlier point and try and trip him up. "If you didn't have anywhere to go, why didn't you wait for the police to show up?" "I probably should have," he admitted. "However, I didn't want to press my luck and be seen by this other guy who could take on several guys armed with knives." She nodded, and then snapped her notebook shut and stood up, extending her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Yell. That is all for tonight. I will call if I have any further questions. Hopefully, it'll be at a more reasonable time." Arthur took her hand and shook it before leading her out. "Thank you, Detective. I hope you figure everything out." As she was walking down his stoop, she turned and said, "Oh, one last thing. You said he wasn't wearing a mask or any sort of identity concealment?" Arthur unconsciously turned very slightly toward the mask behind him on the table that he had left there all day. "That is correct, Detective." "Thank you again, Mr. Yell," she said, and walked to her car and drove away. The next day, Detective Smith sat down at his desk across from hers. "So, did you interview that Arthur Yell guy yet?" Barbara nodded. "Yeah, I went rather late at night and tried to get him to slip up a few times." "And? What do you think? Should he be a suspect?" "And I don't know. He had a good answer for everything I asked, and each answer seemed reasonable on its own, and put together, he has a coherent story. He was on the defensive for part of it, but given how I was asking the questions, that's a normal reaction from someone who's innocent. But how often do people who made their living beating the shit out of someone stumble across someone beating the shit out of some random street thugs? To me, that's a pretty big coincidence. And he had a black actor's mask on a side table, and when I was walking out the door and mentioned masks, he did subconsciously turn toward it. That doesn't seem like much to go on." "No, it doesn't. I would say that overall, we don't have enough to consider pursuing him at the moment. There are a couple other possible leads for me to start down." What leads will Barbara follow next? When will Arthur have his next shot at being the pugilist? Find out that and more next time on The Pugilist, Episode 3, Max, which will be on this station on December 5th.